And this afternoon we have three excellent speakers. Each of them will give a 15 to 20-minute presentation, and we're going to wait to the very end to have the Q&A. All right, so our first speaker is George Martine. So can I just ask George to come on up and let's get us going.
Good afternoon, everybody. Peter just told me my job is to keep you all awake until the real speakers get a chance to come here. Okay, so I'm going to keep you awake with cartoons as well. So, well, over today and the next couple of days, you've been exposed to a wealth of information. You're being exposed to a wealth of information and useful suggestions about how to plan sustainable cities. But I think that most of this focus is on existing cities and on past problems. What I want to emphasize today is that we're only at the halfway point in terms of our urban history and our urban problems. What we're seeing today is just the tip of the iceberg. And all the population that has amassed to this day from the beginning of history will double by mid-century. The implications of this are mind-boggling. So, should we worry? I'd say, on the contrary, we should really celebrate the opportunity that we have to use cities to resolve the enormous economic, social, environmental, and demographic problems of the world. But in order for the cities to fulfill their role, to fulfill their potential, we need to have a firm grasp of the issues and get the policies right. Unfortunately, that is not what I am seeing from most of the countries which are being most affected by urban growth. So during the next few minutes, what I will do is briefly review urban growth trends so that we establish some common ground with respect to the future and to this process. And then I'm going to focus on just two major policy suggestions. First of all, the need to plan ahead for the needs of the poor. And secondly, the need to take a proactive stance towards what I call the sustainable use of space. Cities concentrate population, economic activities, emissions, poverty, vulnerabilities, but they also concentrate the solutions. The main message that I want to bring is that massive urban growth in developing countries is inevitable, whether we like it or not, and most policymakers in developing countries do not like it. This massive growth can be very positive or very negative, depending on how we approach it and if we approach it with a proactive stance. Unfortunately, too many policymakers are failing not only to plan ahead, but are taking a negative attitude and are trying to prevent it. According to a recent United Nations survey, the proportion of developing countries having policies that try to retard or stop urban growth in some way has jumped from 44% to 74% over the last 30 years. And they're particularly reluctant to absorb the poorest elements of the population. But in doing so, they're not only making it difficult for the poor to take advantage of what the city has to offer, but they are also endangering the viability and the sustainability of the city itself. Massive urbanization is a very recent phenomenon. We have records of cities from 3,500 BC. But for most centuries, the proportion of the world's population living in towns and cities has been small. As late as of 1850, only 7% of the total population was urban. But you see what has happened since then. We're now at 50% urban, and then this proportion will reach 70% in 2050. But this change is not nearly as important as the change in the absolute number of urban population. In the now industrialized countries, which is this lower line, growth was much more gradual, and it will basically stabilize at around 1.1 billion people. But in the developing world, this will literally explode in size, as you see in the red figures. It has already multiplied 70 times since 1850, and the numbers are expected to push past 5.2 billion urban inhabitants in 2050. So this last section to the right of the yellow line is what we need to worry about. That tail of the plane looking thing in red is the urban growth that we need to urgently address. And I think we're focusing a lot of our attention on the past problems rather than on what is going to happen. Obviously, urban growth varies very much by region, and it's crucial not only because of the absolute size, but where it's going to happen. It's mostly going to happen in low and middle income countries in Africa and Asia. These two regions are expected to experience a doubling of their urban population in only 30 years. So, as we see from this chart, Asia and Africa will account for almost or over 80% of all future urban growth, and developing regions will comprise 93% of the total growth. Now, where and in what kind of cities will this huge new urban population be found? Well, much is still made of megacities. Our favorite topic whenever urban area issues come up is megacities, cities with more than 10 million people. And without a doubt, the number and importance of these huge dynamos has increased. But the megacities shown here in the front row still make up only 9% of the urban population. The middle rows of cities, those having from 1 to 5 million, maintains around 13% of the world's total urban population. But it's the smaller cities, the ones in the back, less than 500 million people, the ones in the back row, they will continue to harbor half of the urban population in the foreseeable future. In a territorial and political sense, it would seem much easier to deal with them because they have more opportunities, they have more flexibility. But they often lack the technical and financial capacity to promote sustainable growth. In other words, this may be where we have the cities that need most help. Another commonly misunderstood issue is the source of urban growth. Most people assume that the urban explosion in developing countries comes mostly from rural to urban migration. And this is important because on this basis of this belief, people often try to prevent rural-urban migration. They can't really do it, but they believe that this will stop further in growth. But the fact is that more and more urban growth is due to natural increase in the cities. That is to say, the difference between fertility and mortality and of the population already residing in urban areas. Of course, countries that have had radical anti-urban policies such as China and Vietnam owe more of their urban growth now to migration and also to reclassification of cities. But the historical fact is that over time, the natural increase of urbanites tends to become the largest proportion of all growth. In other words, instead of trying to prevent migration and thus urban growth, people need to prepare ahead for inevitable growth. Unfortunately, negative attitudes towards urban growth tends to lead to negative policies, and most affected by this are the poor, who make up more than half of the total urban population. In developing regions, the existing slum population of the developing world is about 1/3. In Africa, this proportion is more than 60%. But when we look at the main sources of growth, which are migration and natural increase, actually the proportion is even higher. So the largest contingent in urban growth is made up of poor people. The failure to attend to the needs of the largest social category in a proactive manner, the poor, what happens? This leaves them to fend for themselves. And that's why they end up building their shacks in the worst possible places. Now, the poor obviously suffer from this because it prevents them from taking advantage of what the city has to offer. But it's extremely important to realize that the city itself also suffers, because the poor locate and expand in inadequate areas. It becomes much more difficult for the city to plan for infrastructure and services. The environment also suffers because these landless people may settle in watersheds, steep slope forested areas, floodplains and riverbanks, or in areas that have rich biological diversity. So as a result, the city can become ugly, difficult to administer, foul-smelling, and environmentally problematic. In such conditions, the city is unattractive to potential investors and leaving it behind in the generalized competition for investments. Without economic activity, it's unable to offer employment to its growing population, and also lacks the tax base to provide improvements in infrastructure and services. So in short, dealing with the housing needs of the poor is a starting point for reducing a vicious circle that is harmful not only to the poor themselves, but to the quality of life of the entire city. What can we do to transform the impending urban explosion to something positive for development? Given the negative effects of letting the largest social contingent fend for itself, the poor, I'd say the first thing we need to do is really to attend the housing needs of the poor. Improving access to land and housing of the poor requires both planning ahead, collaboration with neighborhood associations and organizations of the urban poor. It requires a vision, a social vision. Once a political decision has been made to help the poor, and this is not an easy political decision, then the first thing to do is to ensure a supply of affordable land. And this isn't something that can be done once and for all. There's no magic bullet here, but it requires considerable advanced planning, a vision, and a constant attention to future needs. In sum, it requires vision and political will. Now, the functioning of the land markets itself has to improve, despite the very real and huge obstacles that we all know of. And also in attending to the needs of the poor, we have to be realistic. There's no way that full housing and services can be provided by for everybody in any country. But providing minimally serviced land that can be purchased by the poor over time and over which people gradually improve their homes is entirely feasible. What happens if you don't take this proactive attitude? You get this kind of slums where anything that you try to do is going to be more difficult and more expensive to try to correct after the slums have spread spontaneously. So it becomes almost impossible to provide people with minimal services or to improve the city's infrastructure. Where are you going to put a road, infrastructure, telephone, and so on? So the next step in promoting a win-win situation here requires what I call promoting the sustainable use of space. From an environmental standpoint, it's crucial that we start by avoiding the invasion of critical ecosystems and also dangerous hotspots. Moreover, we need to minimize the size of the urban blot. Urban areas occupy around 2% of the world's land area, so it's really not a big blot. But over time, density of cities in both developing and developed countries has decreased. So we need to favor density and mass transport. One general rule that's applicable to all cities, both in developing and developed, obviously, is the need to favor mass transport. I mean, cars are tremendously expensive for cities in terms of land use, roads, and parking spaces. They contribute to higher carbon emissions, and promoting the sprawling American-style suburbanization also promotes inequity because it inevitably discourages efficient mass transport systems. Cities are also being affected by what we call prairie urbanization, that is to say, the sprawling and uncontrolled expansion fueled by lack of regulations and by speculation in land. Ultimately, what we need is urban planning that is imbued with a systematic concern with the environmental issues, with sustainability. Obviously, we need rules and regulations to do that, but we need also a proactive stance, a political stance, and a vision. In short, what I'm saying is that what we need to do is to narrow the gap between the theory and practice in urban growth. We know that from an economic standpoint, cities always have an enormous advantage in terms of their competitive ability, and these advantages inevitably are heightened by globalization. 80% of all GNP growth is generated in cities. And this has social consequences. By having more resources and also by having the advantages of scale and proximity, cities promote favorable changes in social organization. From a demographic standpoint, if you're worried about population growth, cities are probably the strongest factor in fertility reduction. There's no motivation for large families and in urban areas, and there's generally better access to reproductive health services. The difference on a global scale in poverty levels between urban and rural areas is about 30%. So all of these things there are advantages. There are even advantages from an environmental standpoint. Density and concentration are necessary for preservation and rural biodiversity. And technological solutions that are going to be necessary in terms of promoting a more friendly attitude towards the environment also tend to prosper better, more in urban areas. So despite all of these advantages, what we see is an increase in the number of policymakers that are trying to prevent urban growth and concentration. They see this as something inherently negative. So what we need to do is to promote a more proactive attitude towards inevitable urban growth, because if we don't, then we're going to fall into this trap, which Seneca says that there are really no good winds for navigators who don't know where they're going. Thank you.